This is John from We Are Change. I'm here with Paul Joseph Watson of Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.tv. We're hoping this evening that Paul's going to give us a roundup of the week's events, also going into a little bit more depth as to the first 6 months of the year. As we stand, it's 2nd of July 2011, and obviously a lot has taken place in the first 6 months of 2011. Thanks very much, Paul, for filling us in.
Yeah, well, basically the Bilderberg conference ended a few weeks ago, and since that time we've seen the consensus that was set at Bilderberg reverberate around the geopolitical arena, specifically in regard to Libya. Anders Rasmussen, the NATO Secretary General, was rumoured to be in attendance at Bilderberg, and now, just about a week after the end of the conference, he came out and said that the war would be prolonged, it would be intensified. So the exact information that Jim Tucker got from his sources proved itself to be true in the very week after the conference ended. In addition to that, we had the information that came into us from military sources at Infowars that ground troops would be sent in by the beginning of October. So we've got that in the works. We've also got governments in Europe, like the Swedish government, now authorising to send in Marines, to send in the army, obviously in complete contravention to the UN resolution that declared that only a no-fly zone was permissible. Of course, a no-fly zone means constant bombardment, as we've seen. In addition, on the subject of Libya, which of course has characterised the year so far, Obama told us the war would last days. That was in March. It's now July 2nd, we're still involved, so it's lasted over 3 months, cost nearly $1 billion for the US government alone, taxpayer money. And we had the spectacle this week of Obama giving a speech and saying basically that he doesn't, quote, have to get to the constitutional question. Of course, we know that Bilderberg were terrified of the resistance to the war in Libya from the US Congress, and now that that pressure is increasing on Obama, he's brazenly come out and said, you know, I don't even have to get to the constitutional question. So his chutzpah and arrogance transformed itself into basically just complete ignorance and an insult to the very foundation of what America was founded on. Of course, his own constitutional lawyers, before the no-fly zone was enacted, said that he would have to get permission from Congress, otherwise it would be unconstitutional, but Obama just ignored them. So I've seen an intensification in Libya. Also in the Middle East, what we're going to see is a permanent occupation of Iraq, according to the information out of Bilderberg. We've got this December 31st deadline where US troops are supposed to withdraw completely from Iraq at the end of this year. Of course, we've heard that many times before. But Obama has set the final date of December 31st. Yet, according to US delegates who attended Bilderberg, one said, quote, the US has no intentions of ever leaving Iraq. And so what we're going to see is a media spectacle generated similar to the Afghanistan situation, where Obama withdraws a small amount of troops and many more are left to remain, including mercenaries that they will later add. Also out of Bilderberg, they said, quote, this was a US Bilderberger again, quote, when you think of Iraq, think big. And he later went on to say that Iraq will be used as a launch pad for a wider regional war that will, quote, include every nation in the Middle East except for Israel. So they're going to use it as a launch pad to invade more countries, which is what, of course, the PNAC document said before 9/11. Now, Bilderberg was instrumental in 2002 in delaying the start of the Iraq War, as Jim Tucker documented. It was initially set to go ahead in 2002, and it went ahead obviously the next year in 2003. So what we're seeing out of Bilderberg is a desire to remain in Iraq so that the country can then be used to attack other countries. The last thing to come out of Bilderberg was the fact that one of the activists who was present, who was called Tim, actually was close friends with the hotel manager there at Savretta. Basically a childhood friend. He said he grew up with him. So he's going to get information in fact, he's seeing him today on Saturday the 2nd of July, and he's going to get little tidbits of information of anything that he witnessed, what they talked about, their behaviour, their attitude, etc. So we're going to update people about that.
Also, I think what's keen to know, while we were at the Bilderberg meetings in Switzerland, in St. Moritz, you and I were looking on their official website, bilderbergmeetings.org, and they actually hadn't got any of the talking point discussion topics up on the website or the list of the attendees. Now we're 2 weeks after the meeting. That list of attendees has gone up, as has their talking points. There's some quite interesting points on there. There's one about Switzerland and will she survive or will she recover? And then obviously, as you've been speaking, there's information there on Libya, or there was obviously a talking point on Libya. I mean, this isn't new information to anybody that's been part of the alternative media, the growing alternative media, which is pretty much taking over the mainstream as I see it. When were you aware that there was going to be large-scale wars in the Middle East, not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, obviously following 9/11? There's been information, I know that you have, some of your contributors, Gerald Salente for example, have been talking about additional wars in the Middle East for a number of years. I mean, has this just panned out as you expected it to?
In the sense that there will be more wars, yes it has, but what we're waiting on, and this is what many people fear is coming in 2012, is a combination of all these wars into a wider Middle East conflict, as I just said. And in fact, in 2008 we got the RAND documents where they went to the Pentagon and said basically to divert attention from this economic crisis, we need a big war. And by big war they didn't mean Libya or Iraq, they meant Japan or a major power. Iran was also mentioned. So this is going to get a lot bigger than it is now, and they're going to try and roll these other conflicts into this wider war. So a lot.
How do you? I mean, obviously we had the information that came out during the Tunisian uprising that Eric Schmidt, I believe, of Google, had actually he pretty much admitted to being involved with helping the Tunisian uprising. So how would you explain to a layman what is going on in the Middle East? Is it more that it's coup d'etats being carried out by the West, or is it more that actually the people in the Middle East have had enough of these dictators and they're overthrowing it, or is it a mixture of the two? How do you see it?
It is a mixture of the two, but you have to remember that in the case of Egypt, the US Embassy, at least 1 year before that revolt began, got the information saying that it would happen, that Mubarak would be toppled, and that they were deliberately trying to fund and influence the groups that would do it. So when all these leftists come out and say that, what happened in Egypt is this big successful example of a secular revolution which is not based on religious dogma, they don't even reference the fact that the US Embassy had anticipated it at least a year before and had sought to encourage it. And of course it led through Egypt and these other countries to Libya, which is of course the so-called protesters that they launched this fake no-fly zone war on were in fact rebel Al-Qaeda commanders. They were flying fighter jets, they were driving tanks. To claim that they were protesters was just an insult to anybody's intelligence. So the fact that it led from Egypt through to Libya, and then on the flip side you've got a situation in places like Bahrain, which is the government is completely controlled by Western interests. There's the same level of brutality going on there against protesters, and yet you barely read about it. But if it's in somewhere like Syria, where the US, they're moving now their warships to the Mediterranean coast of Syria, then you hear all about how the government's oppressing protesters. So the fact that the government is oppressing protesters has gone on in the Middle East for decades, but now it's all coming to a head. They're choosing very carefully which countries they push in the media as, you know, the big humanitarian crises, because they've got a list. I mean, you don't have to have a crystal ball. Read the PNAC documents. They've got a list of countries they want to invade, and the ones that are on it are the ones we're hearing about now in terms of brutality against protesters.
Yeah, and obviously we're not just seeing uprisings in the Middle East, we're seeing uprisings in Greece as of this week because of the Euro bailout, and whether or not the European Union was going to force through restrictions, austerity measures on the Greek people. I mean, are we going to see, we've seen it already hit Spain and France and Portugal. Are we going to see it here at home in the UK, do you think?
Yeah, because, I mean, back in the 70s, we had a similar situation where we went down to a 3-day working week. And at the time, one of the German politicians called Britain or England, quote, no longer a civilised country, because there were continual strikes and basically society almost ground to a halt. You know, there were power outages, there were cuts to public services, there were everything. And it's only just starting now in Britain. We had some big strikes the other day related to transport and teaching and so forth. So everything that you see in Greece is coming to Britain, but it's just the scale of it. I mean, British people are so, you know, lackadaisical and nonplussed about anything that happens. They don't have this spirit of resistance that exists in countries like Greece. On the subject of Greece, again, referring back to Bilderberg, in 2010 Bilderberg said, the euro's in trouble, we need to save the euro, and this was when it was at 119 against the dollar. Now it's back up to 145. They were successful back then. But now with this Greece bailout, which both now George Soros, Nouriel Roubini, these big economic experts have said, you know, basically the euro's on its last legs, it's going to die. They're again in a desperate situation. And this Greek bailout is part of that. They need to continually bail out Greek to prevent it from defaulting and restarting its own currency, which is exactly what it should do, because they would have to devalue their currency, they'd move back to the drachma, and all the tourists would come pouring back in because everything would be so cheap and they could get themselves back up on their feet. But the globalists don't want them to do that, because as Kenneth Rogoff, the Bilderberg member, wrote in the Financial Times just a week before Bilderberg, the survival of the euro, the survival of their global currency program to unite these currencies, to get the Amero in place, depends on the survival of the euro. So if the euro goes, it all goes. So Greece is a continual bailout now. Most people don't understand the bailout that they voted on a couple of days ago. They'll have to do it again in a month, because it only funds the Greece government for another month. So you're going to get that situation on the streets with the tear gas and the bombings and the riots. It's going to happen every month. That can't go on indefinitely. So
unless obviously the Greeks, the Europeans find some solutions and get themselves out of the mess, because they can't expect their elected officials who got them into the mess to get them out of the mess.
Yeah, and it's just going to end up in the collapse of the Greek government, and they're going to ditch the euro. Even mainstream people are saying that. Big Financial Times writers on Newsnight television are saying the euro's dead. It's gone beyond the point of no.
They've been saying it for 12 months.
But the Chinese are propping it up by buying all the bonds, which is why it hasn't dipped against the dollar or the pound. So it's the Chinese again that are propping it up. But
so the Chinese own everything.
Yeah, but I mean, it can't go on forever, is what I'm saying, because they have to keep doing it every month. So, I mean, there's hope in that, because obviously the Greek people are basically fighting the IMF takeover of their country. They're going to be in debt enslavement for decades to come, just like in Argentina 10 years ago.
If we shift gears a little bit at that point, and obviously mention the catastrophe at Fukushima earlier in the year, which I keep seeing on the news every day, isn't as bad as we all were told initially, and you know, it's not really a crisis and all the rest of it, although obviously there's a 50-kilometre exclusion zone around the plant, and They're finding that some people have already got high traces of carcinogenic plutonium and various other materials in their bodies. What do you think has actually been going on behind the scenes there with the nuclear industry?
Well, we know that the severity of Fukushima was downplayed from the very beginning. It's now come out that reactor number 1 was in meltdown within hours of the earthquake and the tsunami. Of course, Japanese denied that at the time. But what's just as interesting is that now we have these leaked emails seen by The Guardian, where just 2 days after the disaster, the British